Welcome to WBC Faster Together, the LinkedIn Live series of Women Business Collaborative. I'm Gwen Young, Chief Executive Officer of WBC. Today, we are joined by Christine Hendrickson, the VP of Strategic Initiatives at Syndio. Syndio is a key partner organization for the WBC, and today we are here to talk about pay equity and the release of WBC's Pay Equity Playbook. For those of you that don't know, WBC is an unprecedented alliance of over 83 women business organizations and hundreds of business leaders building a movement to achieve equal position, pay, and power for all women in business. Through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability, we are mobilizing thousands to create momentum and accelerate the pace of change. We live our commitment to DEI, and members of our leadership, staff, our diverse board of directors, and our advisory council include more than 34% people of color. Every single one of our 9 action initiatives has DEI goals for 2025 and 2030. So please check the chat for our 9 action initiatives through which we aim to accelerate change, and join our movement at wbcollaborative.org. One of the key areas is pay equity, and we are excited to announce the release of our Pay Equity Playbook this week. I look forward to speaking to Christine about this because, as we know, Christine, the pay scale gender gap reports highlights the continued need for equal pay for women. And this year, women earn 83% for every dollar earned. I think we've gone up 10 cents in the past 30 years, right? And this is regardless of job type or worker productivity. So we're getting closer, but we're not quite there yet. Women of color are even lower, as we know. So with Black women earning 72 cents on the dollar and Hispanic women earning 47 cents on the dollar. As well, we know that laws are going through national, state, and local legislatures. It's critical to be proactive to ensure that pay equity and equal pay is there for equal work. So, Christine, let's set the stage. I gave a couple of the figures, but what does pay equity look like today?
Yeah, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Gwen, for having me join. I am just thrilled about the WBC's Pay Equity Playbook. Such a fabulous resource. I really encourage everyone to look at it and use it. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but you're exactly right, Gwen, that we're at a time where the landscape is changing incredibly quickly. Employees have unprecedented and growing access to information about what their own jobs pay and about what other jobs in their organizations pay and what jobs at other organizations pay. And one of the stats that just blows my mind is that, to just show how quickly this is changing, is that in February 2020, only 18% of job listings in the US had employer provided salary information. By August of 2023, so just in this 3-year time window, that number had risen to over 50% of jobs now include pay information. And it's really becoming almost like if you went to the grocery store and there were no price tags on the price of oranges or pears, and now we're at this point where we're beginning to see exactly how much jobs pay. And I think that to me is really the foundation of where we are. And that's because there is this growing wave of pay transparency laws in the US and frankly around the globe. So California, Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Washington State, and many other cities and counties now require that employers actually put the pay range on their job posting. And that's, I think, changing the conversation for employers. So I think that's one big trend that we see is this growing access to information about pay ranges. We're also at the same time seeing more employers beginning to have to file pay reports with the state. So California, Illinois, very soon, potentially even today, Massachusetts may pass a law that will require pay reporting. So it's those two things that we're seeing. One, pay scale transparency, and there's so much going on in that space. And then the second one is on pay reporting.
No, the reporting is really interesting. And I was going to ask you, how important is that kind of policy, right? Because you're sort of talking about two things and two interrelated things, like what companies are doing right for their workforce and for to show their commitment, and then what they're doing because there's sort of these laws and legislation, right? And we know that Europe is legislating pay transparency, as you mentioned. So you think the trend is the laws are important, and what Massachusetts today, is there anything more you want to say about how important the policies and laws are?
It's a great thing. Yeah, you're exactly right that it's not I think that the laws are kind of the foundation of what's happening that have driven some of this. And so just to touch on one other click on the laws, on the European Union just recently adopted a new equal pay and transparency directive. It's going to make the pay equity laws in the US seem almost quaint in their level of transparency. It is certainly going to be the new global high watermark on pay transparency because it will require everything that we've been talking about. So it will require pay scale transparency, it will require pay reporting, and it's all going to be very public in a way that it's not in the United States. But I do think that that the laws are the laws are where you start, but that's not where you want to grow into. One of my colleagues, Nancy Romanishin, often says, "Who needs the law when you have TikTok?" And I think that that's really true. Is that the conversations that are happening in between employees. They're sharing information on Glassdoor. They're sharing information with each other, and so we're finding that more and more of that transparency is happening because of those individual discussions. And so I think that it's really on employers to want to lead that conversation and control what that narrative looks like.
So in addition to the transparency, what else? I know, Cindy, you work directly with companies on this. What else are companies doing, right? Because transparency is incredibly important. You know, we did a snapshot earlier in the year showing what people published for their EEO reports, what they put on the website. But what are some of the other things companies are doing to respond to this need and to show their commitment to pay equity?
I think a couple of things. That's a great question. I think that the biggest one is that when pay ranges aren't a closely held HR secret, employees really want to understand, why do I make what I make? How do I move up in my range? How do I know that my pay is fair? It just kicks off this series of conversations about how does my employer set pay? And so I think one of the things that we're really finding is that employers are really needing to build the muscle around how do you have conversations about pay, and those conversations, which were things that were not something that people were talking about, are now kind of front and center conversations that people are having with their coworkers. And so employers are really needing to build that muscle so that managers and talent acquisition recruiters can answer those questions about really like the clarity around exactly how the employer sets pay and how they move up in the range. So in order to do that, in order to build that muscle, you need to know that. So I think that one of the things that we're finding is that employers are doing much deeper analytics to figure out the answers to those questions. Like, what are the things that we're actually paying for? Are we really paying for experience? How much does performance matter? Do those geographic differentials matter? That type of thing. And then they're also wanting to make sure that they're equitable and consistent across their organization, and that they have managers that are well armed with the ability to have those conversations.
No, it's interesting. And so and what you're saying too is we talk a lot about sort of equal pay for equal work, which is there, but there's some other factors that are playing into that, right? As they're looking at it and having the discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we look at the pay gap has a little bit to do with equal pay for equal work, but it has a lot to do with equal access to opportunity. And so at Syndio, those are the kind of two things that we think that and this comes out so clearly in the playbook that WBC put out, is that you really need to be looking at both sides of that. So you need to be looking at, are we paying people that are doing similar work fairly, but also do people have access to opportunities to advance within their organization? Do we have women and people of color in senior level roles in the organization? And one other thing, it's not just those senior level roles. There's also a lot of functional segregation that happens. So you may have technical roles that pay a lot more than less technical roles within an organization. And if you have a race or gender imbalance in those highly paid roles, it's going to create a major wage gap. So I think that that's a critical part is that you really have to address both sides of that in order to make progress.
And that I think is what helps us understand why sort of women of color have a different pay differential, because it's that access to opportunity. It's also the types of roles and kind of where you sit, right?
Exactly, 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 exactly. And so one of the things that jumped out to me from the playbook was the need to not only look at the adjusted pay gap. So the adjusted pay gap would be looking at people that are doing same or similar work and taking into account things that drive differences in pay. So if someone has a lot of experience, it may be perfectly appropriate that they're paid more. So those are the adjusted pay gaps. But on the pay parity proclamation, WBC says that you really need to look at both of those things, both the adjusted pay gap, looking at equal pay for equal work, but also the unadjusted pay gap, which is really a function of the fact that we may not have equal representation throughout all parts of an organization and throughout all levels in an organization.
No, exactly. And this is where, like, if you look in the proclamation or you look on the WBC website,
Mhm,
we say, we want to ensure pay parity in the C-suite by 2030. We want
mhm.
controlled pay parity in the Russell 3000
Right.
by 2025. And so we try to talk about sort of adjusted, raw, and controlled so that we can
Mhm,
understand, as you said, exactly what we're talking about. So when we go into such a little bit to kind of some of the solutions, right? When you see either sort of setting aside fund to rectify per pay equity. You talk about whether your negotiations and salary
mhm,
negotiations across the bands. What are some of the
mhm,
solutions that companies can be using when they use the data, when they discover, and how they can, I hate to use the word rectify, but rectify the
mhm.
situation?
No, that's exactly right. I think that the playbook really lays this out is that you really need to first start with a roadmap of what that looks like for your organization. Cindy had a workplace equity summit at the New York Stock Exchange, and at that summit, one of the leaders from Microsoft spoke, and she had this brilliant statement, which is she said that every employer needs to find where they are on the transparency journey. And it's a huge range from nothing all the way, she said, from nothing all the way to whoa. And I just loved that because that is exactly right, is that every employer is going to be at a different spot in that journey, but it's really important to continue to put a roadmap together so that you have those concrete steps. Um, and especially, it requires prepping the data and preparing a cross-functional team in order to do that. But after that, I think that you really just need to get into the work and conduct a pay equity analysis so that you're closing the gaps, the equal pay for equal work, the adjusted pay gaps, but make sure that you're doing the second stage, which is also doing an opportunity equity analysis so that you're identifying kind of which parts of our organization may be those high paid roles where we may
Mhm.
have fewer women and people of color in those roles. It's critically important to identify kind of what that is. Unlike pay equity, which can largely be solved with a big check, the opportunity equity takes time and commitment to continue to look at it. So I think that making sure that you're doing both of those is really important, is getting into the work.
So I'm going to ask a question, which I'm sure you get a lot as well, right? Various companies have different sets of resources, different
Mhm.
sizes. It can feel, if somebody says, I'm a small company, I don't have a lot of resources, how do I do this? Kind of what's the guidance you can give, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it starts with exactly what you're saying, which is make sure that you have a structure. So build from a structure of make sure that you understand of how you're grouping employees. So it's easy when you're in a small organization to have kind of fluid levels, and I think that having a little bit more precision around that can go a long way. And I think the pay transparency laws really force employers to do that because they're having to be much more transparent about what their jobs pay, and that requires kind of building that muscle around what that looks like. But there are a lot of resources to conduct analyses. So for small employers, the thing I would say is build your cohorts, understand what your levels are within your organization, and ensure that as you're setting new pay, that you're staying true to that, so that you're looking not just at what the market is, but what are others in similar roles being paid, so that you can ensure excuse me, parity. For larger organizations, I think that there's nothing that beats doing a multiple regression analysis, where you can really identify with precision exactly where there are gaps, if your pay policies are actually explaining the differences in pay, and allow you to make those corrections. Um, but I think that the steps that you lay out in the playbook are exactly the ones that you want to do, which is doing the work, reviewing compensation, utilizing experts, and then communicating those core values, because that communication strategy can
Critical.
be missed and matters a lot, whether or not you're a small organization or a very large organization.
I love that. Yeah, communication is everything, internal and external, what you're doing. And
Hmm.
that's, I think we're learning that more and more across the business landscape.
Hmm.
So we love to end these in kind of the call to actions, right?
Hmm.
So from what is your call to action to organizations or companies that want to ensure pay equity across the organizations? Like what's the call to action today, October 19th,
Hmm.
2023?
My call to action is, let's not sit and admire the problem anymore. Let's move into action. There's so many ways to do that. But the one thing that I would say is that if you're an employer working in a state that has a pay scale transparency law, then you may have already built this muscle around communicating. But if you're not in a state, or you're in multiple states, there's a huge opportunity for you to begin to share your pay ranges, to not just where it's required by the law, but more broadly. Build that as part of your commitment to fairness, and begin the work now. So, and definitely look at the playbook. The playbook is a wonderful resource.
I love that. No, and that's the, yeah. So please look at the playbook. It is on our website. But thank you, Christine, not only for your insights today, but the work we do every day, the work Cindio does and you do. We're grateful your support and the support of all the partners that created this great resource. It's all we have time for. So please, everyone, please go to wbcollaborative.org to learn more about our initiatives to increase women in the C-suite and in the boardroom, to address the underrepresentation of women in all kinds of industries, to look at pay parity and equity. And join us next week and to discuss the latest movements in building equity across the business landscape, and keep up to date on the status of WBC at WB Collaborative on Twitter and LinkedIn. And have a wonderful Thursday.